Zionism. More than 2,000 years after the Jewish diaspora began, in the 8th century B.C., and especially following widespread Jewish assimilation into national groups in the 18th and 19th centuries, a worldwide movement began to recapture a universal Jewish identity, culture, and faith. Part of this mission was for Jews to return to the Middle East, Palestine, and establish a single homeland. But this was not the only issue. The leaders of the Zionist movement, as it came to be called, wanted to preserve the Jewish identity, language, and religion in the face of acculturation. Nathan Birnbaum, an Austrian political activist, is credited with coining the word Zionism in 1891 from the name of a hill in Jerusalem. It is not in its cultural, religious, or language aspirations that Zionism has inspired the most controversy, but rather in its political goals of securing a geographic homeland. The timing of the movement's most notable victory, the establishment of the State of Israel, coincided with a widespread reaction against the violence of anti-Semitism in Europe. There is no doubt that Jews have a historic claim on the land itself. The Bar Kokhba revolt in A.D. 135 against the Roman Empire prompted a large number of Jews to be exiled from the area now known as Israel. Some historians report that the Jewish population of 300,000 was further reduced to 1,000 families during the Christian Crusades in the Holy Lands. From the 1890s until 1948, when Israel began a sovereign nation carved out of Palestine, immigration was mostly voluntary, gradual, and accomplished with due respect for existing land titles. Zionism during the first 40 years of this movement was not about taking public land by force, nor was it about militarism. A continual peaceful transformation would probably have occurred, except for the political actions after World War II, in which the United Nations turned a local and demographic issue into an international and highly politicized one. One of the first decisions made by the UN was when the UN General Assembly accepted the Security Council's recommendation in 1947 to partition Palestine. The same year, the United Nations also got involved in the partitioning of Korea. By June 1950, under a UN resolution, America was back at war, siding with South Korea against the Soviet Union and China, which supported North Korea. The partitioning problems of Palestine and Israel, and North and South Korea, persist to this day. Considering the lives lost and the money spent, it doesn't say much for the UN's peacekeeping efforts or our own foreign policy of the past 60 years. Though I was not active in politics in high school or college, I recall attending a Rotary Club meeting in the early 1950s with my father. The speaker was a college student from Palestine studying in the United States. Her story was about how her family had been forced from their property, which had been in the family for centuries, which was then used for Israeli settlements. I can recall thinking at the time that this did not seem fair to me, and it doesn't seem fair to me today. This taking of land from one group for the benefit of another has been criticized by most Muslims, many Christians, and Jews as well. The entitlement argument that this new arrangement was ordered by God and reflects ancient ownership by the Jews is not an easy case to make. This belief inspires those who support the use of force to achieve an expanding geographic presence for a greater Israel, including most of the Middle East. Zionism as a movement has accomplished wonderful things for the Jewish people and the Jewish faith. It inspired Jews the world over to recapture their language, and to do so in a period of time that it is nearly miraculous. It helped restore the Jewish faith as a living presence and heighten consciousness of Jewish identity and purpose. It is tragic that the political agenda has been so divisive for the Middle East and the world, especially given that the entire mission of creating a homeland might have been accomplished without the use of force. Historian Juan Cole has pointed out that Jerusalem, Palestine, through the many centuries, was under Jewish rule for only about 170 years. In other words, there are many competing claims for the same land, and it is impossible to decide between them. Dozens of other regimes occupied the land for much longer periods of time. For instance, Muslims ruled Jerusalem for 1,191 years. Factual history is not much help in sorting out the emotionally charged religious and secular arguments over who should live in and rule over this region. It seems that there should be a statute of limitation on ancient claims of ownership. Those living and still in possession of titles to land and homes should not be cavalierly dismissed out of a sense of justice. Even with recognizing the ruthless way some American settlements uprooted both Mexican and Indian occupants, I'm certain I wouldn't be too happy to give up without compensation any property I now own to those with claims just hundreds of years old, let alone thousands. Religious interpretations of God's desires are subjective and can never be settled through reason, no matter how logical some would like to make the debate. Though the fighting has gone on for literally thousands of years, and control of the Holy Land has shifted back and forth between Muslims, Romans, Christians, and Jews, and others, there have been examples when the people were left alone for relatively long periods of time. With less government involvement, different religious groups were quite capable of getting along together peacefully. Intermarriage, regardless of religious beliefs, was not unusual. My advice? Leave the young people alone, and they'll find out that they prefer lovemaking to warmongering, and are more anxious to get along with one another than the older generations who stir the pots of war. Give government any kind of foothold, and it will figure out a way to force or incite young people into war-making. The old saying is true: old people in government start the wars, and the young people must fight and die in them for all kinds of cockamamie reasons. Today, the Israeli political lobby is a powerful political force. 200 to 300 nuclear weapons under Israel's control make Israel more powerful than all the Arab and Muslim countries put together. But that's not where the real power lies. The UN can labor tirelessly in controlling one nuclear weapon in Iran that doesn't exist, while the international community does not put pressure on Israel to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In contrast, the world community rarely even admits that Israel's nukes exist. And at the same time, Iran has never been ruled in non-compliance with the NPT. The fact that Muslim nations become annoyed with this policy is written off by most in the West by charging anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, within Israeli politics, there is a great deal of debate and diversity of opinion. The Liberal Party in Israel often raises questions about the apartheid conditions that Palestinians are subjected to. Even newspapers in Israel are willing to discuss this issue openly, but it is essentially never permitted in the United States. Former President Jimmy Carter is now persona non grata for raising the question in his most recent book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. J Street, a new pro-Israel Washington PAC, is challenging AIPAC's monopoly control of the discussion of U.S.-Israeli relations in the United States. The group Peace Now also strives to change the tone and essence of the debate. Other American Jews have spoken out against Israel's treatment of the Palestinians as well. The American Council for Judaism is growing in influence in the American Jewish community, especially with the younger generation. Though it's argued that Jews are motivated to immigrate to Israel because they were exiled from Palestine, only a small fraction of American Jews ever moved to Israel. Even given all of this, my position on Israel is the same as my position with regard to any other countries. I favor a non-interventionist position, consistent with what the American founders favored and what the Constitution enshrines. I would like a policy of peace, friendship, and trade, and no intervention in any country's internal affairs. I'm convinced that this would serve Israel's best interest. Since we generally subsidize Israel, the potential of stopping our aid means that Israel must get tacit approval from the United States for its policies toward its neighbors. We have been known to hinder friendly outreaches by Israel in the Middle East, as well as Israel's use of force to protect her borders. Israel is not a truly sovereign nation as long as it depends on getting U.S. permission to do what it sees is in her best interest. But this is a two-way problem. If Israel would be so bold, something that I do not believe it will be, as to attack Iran without explicit approval of the United States will be blamed anyway, and if war spreads to include Iran, we'll be in the middle of it as long as today's conditions persist. A principled stand against all foreign aid is a net benefit to help Israel. Foreign aid breeds dependency and sacrifice of sovereignty and removes an incentive to promote a free market economy. We subsidize and protect Arab nations with money and weapons, and many of those are not even close to Israel in supporting democratic elections. No aid means Arab Muslim nations suffer more, giving Israel a military plus. But unfortunately, that will never happen, because we must protect our oil, and we will remain in the region for the foreseeable future. Our strong support for Israel practically eliminates any desire for it to work out differences in the region by direct negotiations with organizations like the Arab League. Alliances between moderate states to maintain peace and in opposition to the radical mullahs would be more likely than when we control the whole process. And when we do achieve a peace agreement like the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, it costs the American taxpayers plenty, in perpetuity. This bought peace has cost us well over $150 billion since 1979, and yet friction remains. Artificial peace treaties hinder the need for all involved to rely on commerce and trade to improve the standard of living for both sides and to work out their differences locally. An alliance between Israel and moderate Arab nations may well have developed to deal with Saddam Hussein. That type of a solution would have been a blessing to all Americans. Voluntary support for Israel, either by joining its army or sending money there, is quite different from taxing, borrowing, and inflating to pay for the additional debt burden to support both sides of this constant fight in the Middle East. Zionism and the politics of the entire Middle East are international. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cannot be separated from the general acceptance of our two major political parties that our obligation to support Israel at all costs is deeply embedded in our political culture. The threats toward Iran and the sanctions come at the constant urging of the Israeli right-wing government and their supporters here in the United States. The dissidents who speak out in Israel are rarely quoted here in the United States, and any opposition arising in the United States is rarely reported in our media. As historically controversial and emotionally charged as the Middle East is, logic is not likely to prevail and allow a peaceful solution anytime soon. Misplaced religious passion of the three great religions, which are theoretically supposed to worship the same God, prohibits the universal sharing of the Golden Rule, love for our fellow man and desire for peace. But first, we must see more admission of mistakes made as Ronald Reagan did after the Marines were killed in Beirut in 1983. In his memoirs, he admitted he did not realize how complicated Middle East politics were and that he had made a serious error. That is why he went against his own proclamation that he would never turn tail and run, because he decided that it was in the best interests of the United States to change a failed policy. If we were to stay out of the Middle East, militarily and politically, I'm convinced that it would be most helpful in that a neighborhood solution would more likely occur without us stirring the pot and jeopardizing more Americans being killed in wars yet to come. This policy, I am certain, would be in the interest of Israel and the United States and world peace. Return to the Middle East, Palestine, and establish a single homeland. But this was not the only issue. The leaders of the Zionist movement, as it came to be called, wanted to preserve the Jewish identity, language, and religion in the face of acculturation. Nathan Birnbaum, an Austrian political activist, is credited with coining the word Zionism in 1891 from the name of a hill in Jerusalem. It is not in its cultural, religious, or language aspirations that Zionism has inspired the most controversy, but rather in its political goals of securing a geographic homeland. The timing of the movement's most notable victory, the establishment of the State of Israel, coincided with a widespread reaction against the violent Zionism. More than 2,000 years after the Jewish diaspora began, in the 8th century B.C., and especially following widespread Jewish assimilation into national groups in the 18th and 19th centuries, a worldwide movement began to recapture a universal Jewish identity, culture, and faith. Part of this mission was for Jews to rid of anti-Semitism in Europe. There is no doubt that Jews have a historic claim on the land itself. The Bar Kokhba revolt in A.D. 135 against the Roman Empire prompted a large number of Jews to be exiled from the area now known as Israel. Some historians report that the Jewish population of 300,000 was further reduced to 1,000 families during the Christian Crusades in the Holy Lands. From the 1890s until 1948, when Israel began a sovereign nation carved out of Palestine, immigration was mostly voluntary, gradual, and accomplished with due respect for existing land titles. Zionism during the first 40 years of this movement was not about